Jamie Fader. I'm an associate professor of criminal justice at Temple. I put together some questions that I thought would kind of help Ed kind of tell the story of what this book is about. Ed, what was your first contact with the faith-based organizations that support these returning citizens?
My first contact was with Homeboy Industries. I had done field work with Homeboy Industries previously on faith-based recovery, and so, you know, as I was doing this research, that's when I met Eddie, and then Eddie got me involved in the work that he was doing, which was the first time I'd been involved in organizing. And then when I came back and visited Los Angeles, I heard that Homeboy Industries was trying to do organizing, and so I spoke with Jose Osuna, who was trying to found this, and I showed a lot of interest, and he allowed me to follow what they were doing as well.
Can you talk a little bit about the methods that you use to study these groups?
Yeah, I'm a sociologist, and the work that I do is called qualitative methods. Ideally, if I had a lot more time when I worked on this book, it would have been what's called an ethnography, which is what my first book was. And so the purpose of an ethnography is to try to understand how meaning is constructed. It's not used to try to predict, like some sociological theories try to make predictions of, events and outcomes, but the purpose of ethnography is to understand how people participate in things. And so in this case, civic and political action, I think, is the thing that is fascinating. We have not learned enough about how people who have been through the system actively participate in changing their communities. And so that was the question that I grappled with, was how are these organizations helping to expand the rights of the formerly incarcerated, and how are these folks that are participating in this collective and political action, how is it that they are participating? And in this case, that participation was a process of recovery. That's what it meant to them. Those were the meanings of the words that they used, and that's how they constructed their experiences in what we would call political activism.
And what are some of the kind of strengths of this kind of methodology that you use?
I think I think the biggest strength of this methodology is to be able to understand something that would otherwise be seen as anomalous, right? Because we know so little about political activism among people who are formerly incarcerated, it's important to know how they constructed meanings, how they participate in this, instead of assuming, right, that it should look a certain way. Assuming as I had done before I worked on the second book, I assumed that the folks in my first book who did a lot of self-blaming, blamed themselves, didn't blame our government enough, didn't blame institutions enough for failing them. I thought there was supposed to be some sort of political conversion. And I was foolish, because when I saw activism happening, it was happening on different terms than I would have imagined. And so that's the power of ethnography, to help you understand how it is that people engage in the world, and maybe in ways that you wouldn't have expected.
So I think it sounds like ethnography starts with no real assumptions and allows you to kind of build from the ground up, from your observations, instead of imposing something that you've read or a theoretical framework on what you expect to see.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what faith-based community organizing is and how it's different from other kinds of religious practice?
Yeah. So faith-based community organizing is, it's more like community organizing than it is anything else. Because Sal Alinsky, the founder of modern American community organizing, founded the Industrial Areas Foundation, which became really powerful by organizing religious congregations. And so the Industrial Areas Foundation, which is one of the 4 big networks of faith-based community organizing shaped the field to such an extent that these other major faith-based community organizing institutions are somewhat similar to the IAF, but it's it's an entire culture in itself. It's very distinct from like the moments of madness that we see on TV when there's protests, when there's large-scale protests and people are upset about who is our president, right? When everybody's just angry and marches on the streets. Community organizing is very purposeful and deliberate. It takes a great deal of commitment. It builds on people's relationships. There's a lot of workshops and trainings. And the term, I think, the best term that captures what community organizing attempts to do is to build capacity, right? Because then, once you have people that are trained to behave, to engage in the public arena, you can do a number of things with that. So faith-based community organizing is this way, a very sensitive treatment of community organizing where you're working with congregations and you're drawing from people's spiritual beliefs to help compel them towards greater compassion, towards more just laws, and addressing those problems that afflict the people that are furthest on the margins.
Okay. And what were some of the most important findings in this book?
I think some of the most important findings, I think it was understanding that even when people who were formerly incarcerated participated in civic engagement, right, and they learned all these lessons, like what is a one-on-one, how do you do one, right? How do you run a house meeting and talk about issues and connect them and identify targets, and these like organizer trainings, like how do you do a one-day training, and how do you prepare for meetings, how do you debrief from them? Despite all of these rules that exist in the field of community organizing that folks who are formerly incarcerated learned, despite all of that, which they learned it well, there was still a certain amount of agency, a certain amount of creative expression that people had in these spaces to make and to remake what we call community organizing and enforce, because it was much more institutionalized in the Homeboys LOC. I think you could see the verbal rituals from recovery coming out as people gave check-ins at the beginning of a meeting, or as people broke out and gave testimonies, or folks talked about comparing the work that they were doing as organizers to the things they used to do in their past and how they were trying to like be better people. I mean, that effort to make good from one's past, right? That was really what gave life to these spaces. And I think that was the important lesson, is that people who've gone through recovery have a lot more agency than I think we give them credit for, and we assume that rehabilitation programs or reentry programs that teach people how to blame themselves are just a dead end, and they're not, because people leave these programs and they're able to come together and to draw from this way of engaging to actually do things that are very progressive and to change their communities.
And what were some of your more surprising findings?
So I have to be honest, I think everything that I just described was surprising to me. I knew so little about organizing, and I guess maybe that's the lesson, is that this field is far more complex than many of us understand. And so I have a great amount of appreciation. So I have this, there's a student at Loyola University of Chicago, Jennifer Cosilion. She's my co-author in 2 of these chapters. And her work is on a family-focused type of community organizing that is explicitly against this model, which, people organizing, if you read this book, people organizing with the Linsky model separate public and private. And it would have you believe your family's got to stay at home for you to be doing good work out in the community. And so Jennifer worked, she followed this group that was doing family-focused community organizing, and it was the opposite. They were teaching mothers, women of color, how to become activists in their communities, but precisely by bringing their families into the space. And so I think there's still a lot that we don't understand about organizing, and I have a very deep appreciation for how complex it is. And I think maybe an area that we still have to learn more about is how to make these spaces themselves inclusive, which means, how do we bring people in so that it's more reflective of the communities, rather than the people that are more easily able to make time, to attend these meetings and to engage in this stuff.
Okay. How have the people in your book responded to your findings?
I guess I'll find out because the book came out. I'll find out more because there are so many people who I interviewed for this book. I interviewed 34 people for this book, and there were many other people that were aware of the work that I was doing, and so I really am going to have to just see the reactions from everyone. But up to this point, it's been favorable, and Eddie was really grateful, who is like the main person in this book. There was one point where I wrote this small piece for Sojourners, the magazine Sojourners, which is like about faith-based activism, and I shared it with Eddie and Catherine. It was just like this 4-paragraph piece, and that was the first time I shared something written with them, and immediately they got back to me and said, no, this is not going to work. The way that you're presenting Eddie, is inappropriate. In the first sentence when I introduce Eddie, I call him a former gang member and someone who was formerly incarcerated. And it's funny how, as a professor, I don't think enough about how I present people in my book, and how that is so different from the way that I present myself and, yourself. This is Dr. Jamie Fader. We use titles when we present people that we know, right, in our field. And I felt like I was really grateful they gave me that comment, because it wasn't just going to be for the purposes of presenting Eddie properly, but presenting other people in the book. I need to talk about where they are right now. That's who they are. And I can talk about their past, but first and foremost, I need to appreciate who they are right now.
I mean, that's a really interesting point in thinking about kind of the challenges of doing this kind of work. Is the process of what you did is known as member checking, right? So you write something, you think you know what's going on, and then you go back to the people you're writing about and say, what do you think? And sometimes they really literally check you and say, you don't have it right, or I object to the way that I've been characterized. But that's a really critical piece of it, because you are in a position to represent them in a book. And that's a privileged, powerful position. So you could have waited till the book came out and then asked them how they felt about it, and that would be pretty different.
Right.
So it's a way of sharing power, I see, that's in a process that's kind of inherently unequal.
And I did share the manuscript with them a couple times before it went to press. But that was the big comment that I got, was with the Sojourners. This small little written piece in Sojourners, I learned a lot just with that one piece. And I reflected on that as I wrote the book. And Eddie and Catherine looked at the book a few times, a few different drafts of it. And there were little fact-checking things that I needed to correct. But apart from that, they really liked it.
How do you hope that this book will be used, that the things that you found in here will be used by different groups that are working with returning citizens and faith-based organizations?
I've communicated about the findings in this book with people already, and by far the clearest contribution that comes out of this research is that moving away from this idea of community organizing happening because you're reaching the people that stand to benefit from the legislative change or the proposed ordinance or policy, both in Forest and in LA Boys, Homeboys LOC. There was this question, right? Why don't we have more people in this room? And why don't we have more people that fit the profile of this bill that could pass, that could help people? If this bill is going to help, if the ceiling bill is going to help people that have class 3 and class 4 felonies, why aren't there more people with class 3, class 4 felonies in this room? And so people ask those questions. The lead organizers, like the people with experience, years of experience, like a decade of experience in the field, both in Alley Voice and in CRS that were attending for us, they, and it was like an accountability check, like what are we doing wrong, right? And it was a good question, and I think you have to ask this question. But I think, what I found through the course of my work and what I communicated with folks, that none of us sort of expected to find was that the space itself is therapeutic, and for that reason, people are there. And so you have people that have these severe records, like Eddie, who committed a murder. The ceiling bill did not apply to him, but he felt that it was his purpose to be there and to make sure that it passed so that other people would not have to go through what he went through. And so understanding that folks are there to help others, right? And it's more than just about passing an ordinance that helps yourself, but being able to participate in this process of helping others. That's the real draw. That's what helps. That's why people showed up. And I think that could be a benefit to folks in the field of organizing that are trying to grapple with these issues of how to fill up a room with people.
I think earlier today we were having an interesting conversation about the kind of work that returning citizens have to do on their pathway home. And all of the kind of structural barriers are well documented, finding employment and housing and dealing with substance use. But I think what this book touches on is something that's just as difficult, but it's an emotional component of coming home and convincing those in your circle that you are redeemed, that you are a new person. And that is very challenging. But I think, as you're able to point out here, is how people can kind of hook into organizations as a kind of mechanism for doing that, and for presenting themselves as a redeemed person. And then it feeds back to them, right? Then their resolution in their new self is reaffirmed, and it becomes kind of a cyclical process. Do we want to open it up to?
Sure, I'd love to take questions from folks. If there's any questions. Yeah.
How did your identities influence or impact the relationship that you made with the people that you were working with?
That's a good question. In my first book, which was on faith-based recovery, I noticed that me being someone who's getting a PhD at the University of Southern California, which is a very privileged institution, but yet having come from the background, right, like the same neighborhoods, and my cousins, joined gangs, and so having a lot of similarities with folks that I was studying put me in a position where they felt like I was going to be able to hear their story and tell people about it. Like I had this platform because I was doing research and I wanted to know about their stories. They were eager to share, and they felt like they had not been validated for the work that they were doing, for how they had been reformed and how these organizations they worked with, how they were doing really important work. So it was like back in 2008, a lot of folks felt like they wanted it out there in public, how important what they were doing was, and really that they were changed. They weren't the same old people. And so that I noticed that my position as being someone who was getting a PhD elicited like some of these performances. I mean, I would turn on the tape recorder and I'd ask one question. I'd sit down to eat with someone and pull out a tape recorder and start recording and ask one question, and the person would talk for half an hour before taking a bite of their pizza. I mean, like they were just that inspired to share everything with me. And so I think there was some of that in this book as well. I mean, the fact that I have a platform gets people kind of excited, especially people who feel like the world doesn't yet understand what it is that they're doing. And so, I think the wrong way to do this type of work would be to say, well, how do I know that the things that they're saying are true? Because maybe they're saying a bunch of things and they aren't true and they're not really changed. But I felt like the thing that was true, that I could say was demonstrably true, was that they were engaging in this performance as I spoke to them, and that my presence was meaningful to them for that reason. And so that's a fact. You can't, I mean, I feel like I witnessed that, right? Regardless of what it was that was going on in their personal lives, I knew that to be true.
I have a follow-up question. Did you get to meet, like when you were talking, when you sat down with someone, were you able to get to know them through their family or through like people that were most important to them? Or were you only really getting to know them through like what they're telling you?
That's a good question. In some cases I did, meet for this book. In some cases I did get to know, their family. Like Eddie, for example, his wife Catherine wanted to have my wife and I over for dinner, and then and they both, coincidentally, my wife had twins and Catherine had twins at the same time, and so so there's all these connections, and it's like we talk all the time, and we talk a lot, and so that so I like there was one time Catherine, and I obviously don't write about this in the book, but like Catherine called my wife and said, we had this, this conversation, and Eddie said something really hurtful. Could you talk to Ed and have him talk to Eddie, and help him understand things a little better? And so, so I think there was a level of depth in this book that I didn't have in the first one, where I was able to, especially through Eddie, to really get to know people. It was also my position in life, right, as being a little older, being in a relationship, having kids now, like I could carry that conversation a little better and gain access to those spaces. Where before I was like in my 20s, I was young, kind of immature, like I wouldn't have been able to carry those conversations and enter into those spaces the same way.
Cool.
I want to circle back to a comment that you made coming from your first book, which is focusing on leaving gangs. And you mentioned that, the standard kind of way of thinking about 12-step or other kind of treatment-oriented discourses, that it's very self-blaming and that it's damaging. And you began to see that in a new way and began to see how people are more agentic than we give them credit for. This is something I spent a lot of time thinking about because I wonder, in thinking about how people change, right? Specifically how they leave kind of their criminal past behind, but how people make all sorts of changes in their lives. How much agency is an ideal amount of agency? And is it possible, some people use the term super agents, right? There are people who believe they have total control over their lives, and could be problematic when there are actual social structures that prevent you from going everywhere you want to go in life. And so if you don't see those barriers, you may internalize failures in a way that wouldn't be there if you saw, structures in place. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on this.
I think community organizing gives people the framework for being able to be sober in their assessment of what's achievable and what's not. Because the most important thing is being able to identify things that you can change and taking those on. You can't send people down a rabbit hole with a bad campaign that you can't win, because you'll lose all your members. And so there's a tremendous amount of accountability built into organizing, where there's a way that you have to prepare for meetings, there's a way that you have to debrief from meetings, there's certain comments that you make. And in the book I describe this one interaction. I set up a meeting on the north side with the elected official from my district, and I was supposed to run the meeting, and so I was with Eddie and with a couple other people, a couple other organizers, and right from the beginning of the meeting, because I began by mentioning that I had just moved to this district and how nice it was to be in the city of Chicago. The Illinois representative cut me off and said, why don't we go straight into introductions? And we went into introductions, and then he guided us through every agenda item on the agenda. When we left that meeting, it was time to debrief. We debrief immediately after every meeting, and Eddie asked, okay, so what could we have done better? And I saw it coming, and I was red in the face, and one of the guys said, Ed, he described how it was that I allowed the representative to take control of the agenda, and then Eddie framed it, right, like in organizer speak. He said, "Ed, you gave the power away," and it was the most shameful moment. I mean, I was red in the face. I was so embarrassed. But it's a form of discipline, right? There are ways of doing this, and don't get ahead of yourself. Don't think that you can be an individual and rewrite the playbook, right? And since that one experience, I've learned never, ever, ever to open up a meeting with an elected official in any other way besides to say, let's start with introductions, and to be the person to say that, to make sure that you don't lose control of the meeting. But I think there's a certain number of practices in community organizing that, really set parameters so that you're not unrealistic about what you as an individual are capable of achieving. And another thing that I noticed too was after these like big events, going down to the state capitol and getting all the votes needed to pass a bill, when we would debrief from those events, always the emphasis was like, what did we learn? Always the emphasis was, that there's power in groups. It's not about the individual, and that was a lesson that never got old.